Lebanese connection. Film describes the history of Santa Barbara, for example. Santa Barbara was born in Baalbek, and holy remains of Santa Barbara now are in Kyiv, St. Volodymyr church. Then, of course, at times of Vasily Grigorovich Barsky, story of Grigorovich Barsky in Lebanon. Then it's Mykola Gogol in Lebanon, in Beirut. Then it's Ahatanhel Krymskyi and Mikhail Naime in Poltava. Also, it's very nice story of love story of Mikhail Naime. And of course, we found one more very nice connection between Lebanon and Ukraine. It's about Lebanese ruler of Mount Lebanon, Mutasarrif. His name Muzaffar Basha. I found in some archives the name of Chaika Tchaikovsky. His name was Stanislav Chaika Tchaikovsky. It means that his father was Mikhail Tchaikovsky, very famous Ukrainian and Polish writer. And for 5 years, 1902-1907, he was a Mutasarrif of Mount Lebanon. It's also a story about Muzaffar Basha. And then, of course, it's more recent times, and finally it's a modern story about Ukrainian books, Ukrainian community in Lebanon, etc. But we just show us very small part of this film. It's about Ahatanhel Krymskyi. It's like 10 minutes in Ukrainian and Arabic, with Arabic subtitles. It's story of Ahatanhel Krymskyi in Beirut and Shweir. Okay, now our audience is already here. Oksana, I just like to mention once again that this film, the director of this film is Stanislav Litvinov, and that's it.
That's it. How long is the episode?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So I think we can start. I hope it will work.
Але видатний українець Агаtanhel Krymskyi розкаже українцям про іванську історію. Рукопис найрозі оповідань, який я зараз тримаю в руках, Агаtanhel Krymskyi написав українською мовою у 1897 році. Вперше книга з'явилася друком у часописі «Нова громада» у 1906 році. У цих оповіданнях письменник відтворив повсякдення тогочасного Либану, насамперед взаємини між східною і європейською культурами. Агаtanhel народився 1871 року в українському місті Володимир-Волинський і вже у 18-річному віці володів 8 мовами. У Бейруті Агаtanhel Krymskyi жив у районі, який називається Рмеїв. Це була не дуже багата, але жвава частина Бейруту, наче Київський Поділ. Він любив прогулюватися біля палаців родини Сюрсо і ходити пішки аж до Американського університету у Бейруті. Агаtanhel Krymskyi вчив живу арабську мову, збирав стародумки, раритети і, звичайно, арабську літературу. Про його життя у Лівані ми дізнаємося з листів. Всього за цей час Krymskyi написав близько 180 листів, 150 своїм рідним і 30 своїм друзям і колегам. Ahatanhel Krymskyi провів у Швеї 6 місяців, з травня по жовтень 1897 року. Він ходив усіми вузенькими старими вуличками, милувався краєвидами навколо і, звичайно, заходив до старої православної церкви Святої Марії, якій понад 600 років.
Maar om Habib Reis en Reis die Schwer
نحن هلا بضيعة الشوارع نفسها اللي هي متعمرة من أكثر من 100 سنة. وهذا الشارع اللي وراي هذا أقدم شارع عندنا هون، وهو اتس ماركت بليس، يعني كان شارع التجارة أهم شيء. وهذا الشارع هو الشارع اللي كان بيمشوه أكثرية الناس بتضايع عنه. وبيناتهم مستشفى كريمسكي اللي عايش عندنا هون بالضيعة بال 1896 و 97 وقضى فيها فترة شكلية كاملة هون، كتب عن الحياة اليومية تبع أهالينا. وهالكتابات تبعه كانت مهمة لدرجة إنه نحن أخذنا لمحة عن كيف كانوا الشوالية يعيشوا بهالفترة هيدي من وراء كتابات. وهالكتابات تبعه كثير من الإداريين عنا أو من الأشخاص اللي بيكتبوا تاريخ استشهدوا فيها لأنه كانت مهمة تاريخيا. Цікава деталь, яку описав Агаtanhel Krymskyi. Будинки у Швеї не мали гострих верхів, їх принесли французи. Будинки тут просто покривалися деревом, соломою і глиною, і можна було спокійно переходити з одного будинку на інший. Наші пошуки будинку, в якому проживав Агаtanhel Krymskyi у Швеї, увінчалися успіхом. Ось цей будинок, в якому проживав наш земляк. І він належав і зараз належить родині Атаї. У 1918 році Агаtanhel Krymskyi переїжджає до Києва. Він стає одним з засновників і неодмінним секретарем Української академії наук. Також організовує судознавчі студії, працює директором Інституту української наукової мови. Цікаво, що мені також довелося працювати вченим секретарем відділення Національної академії наук. Тому справою академічної солідарності стала для нас підтримка видання бейрутських оповідань арабською мовою. Переклад здійснив українознавець-перекладач Імадевін Реав, який також переклав і «Зів'яле листя» Івана Франка та «Історію України».
Он собрал в этой рассказе очень ценную информацию о жизни Бейрута, ежедневной жизни. Я наслаждался вначале, читая его бейрутские рассказы, и решил, так очень давно, конечно, еще работал тогда в газете, что хорошо бы, если был достаточно рассказов, как они были печатаны в Украине в Киеве в 1906 году и перевести на арабскую. Это так долгий день, но я смог это делать в конце концов. И сейчас так готовимся к второму изданию этой книги.
Так, ім'я Агаtanhela Krymskого і увесь його сходознавчий урок голосно прозвучали у арабському світі. Окей, вау. Агаtanhel Krymskyi. Дайте це, дівчата.
Що? Так він відпросився. Він сказав, що йому, да. Та взагалі ні. Цей. Угу. Доброго дня ще раз. Good afternoon, dear colleagues, and I'm happy to open the third panel of Ahatanhel Krymskyi conference. Please. Ahatanhel Krymskyi conference, and the name of it, the title, Ahatanhel Krymskyi Contribution to Middle Eastern Studies. And this panel is presented by three speakers. All of them are from Ukraine. And first of all, I would like to give the floor to Ivan Sivkov, Ph.D. in Philology, Associated Professor at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv, Ukraine, and areas of his professional interests: history of Arabic language, Arabic lexicology, Arabic terminology, Arabic legal terminology, the history and development of the Islamic law and its schools, the political thought in Islam, the concept of government in Islamic law, history of the Arab world. And excuse me, and his paper is called Ahatanhel Krymskyi Studies of the Quranic Lexicon, with special regard to the etymology of the borrowed Quranic technical terms of religion. Go ahead, Professor. Please switch on your microphone. Включіть свій мікрофон, будь ласка. Ага, дякую.
Пане Олено, дуже дякую. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'm very pleased to participate in our conference, and I would like to thank all the organizers of our conference, and I would like to thank everyone just for giving me the chance to present my short paper, and I will hope that my paper would be very short, just not to take much of time for our colleagues, and I would like just to present the bulk of the factual material in the paper, and I hope I will do so. My name is Ivan Sivkov. I'm associate professor of at Shevchenko National University of Kyiv, and the topic of my presentation is Ahatanhel Krymskyi Studies of the Quranic Lexicon, with special regard to the etymology of the borrowed Quranic technical terms of religion. I'm sorry, may I show my presentation? Пані Олено, будь ласка, чи може презентацію включити?
Так, доступ у вас є. Доступ у
вас
вас
є.
Просто share screen зробіть, поширити.
Share screen. Ага, зараз, пані Олено, хвилиночку.
Все добре, ми нікуди не поспішаємо, насолоджуємося нашим спілкуванням.
Ага, так, дуже дякую. Так, є. Так, шановні колеги, ви всі бачите, так, презентацію? Монтаж. Окей. От space. Is it okay?
Yes. Є. Можете починати від першого.
Ага. In his The History of Arabs and Secular and Spiritual Arabic Literature and in Ukrainian in Russian, История и арабской литературы светской и духовной. Ahatanhel Krymskyi deliberates the lexical peculiarities of the Quranic text and draws special attention to existence of the words of non-Arabic origin in the Quran. In style of his European predecessors and contemporaries in the field of Oriental and particularly Islamic studies, he highlights the problem of the etymological attribution of the Quranic lexicon of evidentially non-Arabic extractions. So he states that the text of the Quran is full of the semantically interpreted loanwords from Hebrew, Syriac or Syrian Aramaic, Greek by Syriac, and Philology. So the terms in question etymologically discussed by Ahatanhel Krymskyi are Furqan revelation, Salat prayer, Millah religion from Syria, Mathani, 7 often repeated verses from Aramaic, Aliyun, having book where all good deeds of the righteous men are written from classical Hebrew. Havariyun, the apostles, Shaitan, Satan, Ma'idah, a table, Nashia, the rising. All this lexicon is from Old Ethiopian language.
So Ahatanhel Krymskyi also maintains that some terms of the Quran as Hesrin, the discharge of wounds, Sijin, the book where the annual deeds of unbelievers and sinners are written. Tasnim and Salsabil, the spring in paradise, were coined by the Prophet Muhammad to render a solemnity and mysteriousness of the Quranic text. So the present paper aims to refine some lacuna of the philological analysis of the Quranic technical terms of religion specified by Ahatanhel Krymskyi himself as strange and problematic. The bulk of religious terms interpreted by Ahatanhel Krymskyi seems to be borrowed from those Semitic languages that had different ways of contacts with pre-Quranic Arabic and Arabic of the Quran. Such etymological reinterpretation of religious terminology of Quran presented on the material of the Quranic exegesis tafsirs is widely discussed by Ahatanhel Krymskyi himself, the classical Arabic lexicography, and later works of the scholars of Islam. So the primary sources of my research is, first of all, the material of the following works of Ahatanhel Krymskyi. First of all, it is the История мусульманства, the history of Islam. Самостоятельные очерки, обработки и дополнительные переводы из Дези и Гальцинера. And in English, independent essays, works, and additional translations from René Cousy and Ignaz Goldberger. And the first work of Ahatanhel Krymskyi that is the main source of my research is выбранный судознавчей прассе, the selected Orientalist works в 5 томах. Том перший арабістика, Arabic Studies, повне проведення праці, історія арабів і арабської літератури, світська і духовна. The complete reprinting of the work, the history of Arabs and secular and spiritual Arabic literature. So during the etymological study of each of the works borrowed by Arabic from other languages to create a lexical basis of the Islamic religious discourse presented in Ahatanhel Krymskyi's studies, I've made profound use of the corpus of the following exegesis or tafsir of the Quran. Al-Baghawi, Tafsir Ma'alim al-Tanzil, Al-Baydawi, Tafsir Anwar al-Tanzil, Asrar al-Ta'wil, Al-Mahal al-Suyuti, Tafsir al-Jalilain, الزمخشري, تفسير الكشاف, and Ibn Kathir, تفسير القرآن العظيم. So I used the corpus of the dictionaries of classical Arabic to make just more clear the etymologies given by Ahatanhel Krymskyi. So I used such classical dictionaries as Al-Fayyumi, المصباح المنير في غريب الشرح الكبير, الجوهري تاج اللغة والصحاح العربية, الزبيدي تاج العروس في جواهر القاموس, and Ibn Manzur لسان العرب. In addition, I linked a lot of lexical material of such Semitic languages cognate with Arabic as Ethiopian, Aramaic, mainly Syriac, and classical Hebrew from the following dictionaries, as Marcus Yastov dictionary was a Targumim, the Talmuds and Midrash literature, and for Lislau comparative dictionary of Ge'ez or classical Ethiopian language. I used a lot of secondary works of European scholars of Islam and Arabic language and of Quran. So they're presented in this slide. So Ahatanhel Krymskyi says that if the Prophet Muhammad proclaimed that the Quran is composed in the purest Arabic, بلسان العربي المبين, so the language of Quran can be almost called lexically pure or 100% Arabic. So this was partly inevitable because the Arabic had no terms for rendering the new religious ideas that were preached by the Hadiths and the Prophet Muhammad himself. So, for example, such terms as silent prayer was borrowed from the language of Aramaic Christians or Jews. Ahatanhel Krymskyi says that Arabs were compelled to borrow foreign, predominantly Hebrew Aramaic and Greek Syriac technical terms of Judaic and Christian origin. Ahatanhel Krymskyi also says that the foreign words of non-Arabic origin are available in the Quran, and there are not so few of them. And he states also that there are not few of the words of foreign origin in the Quran, and the Prophet Muhammad was fond of using the foreign religious terms, but often would use it as Ahatanhel Krymskyi says, incorrect way. On opinion of Ahatanhel Krymskyi, the Prophet Muhammad used non-Arabic terms or invented new terms to render more solemn and mysterious to his discourse. Ahatanhel Krymskyi gives an example of Prophet Muhammad's usage of foreign words in the way of Furqan, Milla, Aliyun, Mathani. These words are very famous in all Quranic studies and in Arabic language, but I tried to give probably a more detailed philological examination of these words. Ahatanhel Krymskyi says that Arab commentators of the Quran al-Mufassiruna, ignorant of other languages except their native Arabic, gave incorrect interpretations of that terms. As Ahatanhel Krymskyi uses a lot of scientific works and papers of the prominent European scholars of Arabic and Islamic studies of 19th century as Ignaz Goltziger and René Buzy, and he gave in his work some of their papers with a Russian translation, and he tries just to give some comments of it. Mainly his work, The History of Arabs, Arabic Literature, may be called a little bit just not original, because he takes a lot of material of the works of his predecessors, but still, for me, it was just a great discovery. Ahatanhel Krymskyi just suggests that the term salat was borrowed from the language of Aramaic Christians or Jews. Ahatanhel Krymskyi also just tries to give the etymological explanation, for example, of the word Furqan, elevation. Ahatanhel Krymskyi says that this term in Aramaic means delivery and salvation. But the Prophet Muhammad used it in the meaning of revelation in connection with the Arabic root farqa, to divide. Concerning the technical term of religion, of Arabic technical term of religion, Milla, Ahatanhel Krymskyi says that the word Milla, this meaning of word in Aramaic, is used by the Prophet Muhammad with meaning religion. Ahatanhel Krymskyi just uses a lot of previous works, whole authors say that this word was indeed Aramaic, but it was used by Prophet Muhammad in Aramaic language and in Old Hebrew language. This word means the word, but the Prophet Muhammad used it in the meaning of religion, figuratively. And Ahatanhel Krymskyi says that the strange name of the heavenly book in the Quran, Aliyun, is explained from the Hebrew Aliyun, Almighty God. Also, Ahatanhel Krymskyi says that the very strange and the very mysterious word Mathania is Aramaic borrowing Magneta, so it is the analogies of the Hebrew Mishnah, the rabbinic decision. So Krymskyi says that this word Mishnah was understood by the Prophet Muhammad as a statement, a complete sentence. And in the Quran, the expression Sabran min Mathani, the seven Mathani, ostensibly means the first surah of the Quran consisting of 7 verses. So Ahatanhel Krymskyi said that some Ethiopian or Abyssinian words are attested in the text of the Quran. So he gives as examples such words as Shaitan, Satan, Habariduna, the apostles, and Nasha'a, the rising in the night to pray. Ahatanhel Krymskyi says that among the works introduced by Muhammad in Medieval Surah, special attention should be paid to such units of the Ethiopian origin, such as Habariyuna, the apostles, and Ma'idah, the table. And he just gives some short etymologies of these words, and I try just to give the more details etymology using tafsirs or the exegesis of Quran and the classical dictionary and the dictionaries of classical Arabic language. And I think that there is no need to just at least for this moment just to read it all, because I just learned to publish it in my paper. Ahatanhel Krymskyi said that the word Nasha'a, used in the expression Nasha'a Kuleil, meaning the rising and the night for performing appeals, is also of the Ethiopic origin. And some exegesis of the Quran or Mufassirun al-Quran corroborate the opinion of Ahatanhel Krymskyi. And Ahatanhel Krymskyi said that the origin of certain strange words of the Quran as Ghislin, Sijil, Tasnim, and Salsabil stays unsolved. And some conjectures were made that these strange words were deliberately invented by the Prophet Muhammad to render serenity and mysteriousness. After that, I gave my own etymological analysis of this word, but I don't want just to read it in order not to take your time. So the conclusions of my paper. So I carried out the etymological semantical examination of a corpus of terms of religion attested in the Quran and given as an examples of the foreign loanwords by Ahatanhel Krymskyi on the material of the works of the later European scholars in the field of Arabic, Islamic and Quranic studies, and the classical exegesis of the Quran, and dictionaries of classical Arabic language, and drew the conclusion that Ahatanhel Krymskyi etymological proposals are generally corroborated by all sources, excluding the word Mathania, that should be the subject of further studies. Okay, there's no. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for attention.
Thank you very much for your presentations, and we are happy to have you at our conference. And let me please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sivkov. And let me please give the floor to Olena Romanova, Ph.D. in history, senior researcher at the Near and Middle East Department, Ahatanhel Krymskyi Institute of Oriental Studies, National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Olena Romanova is very important researcher. She got Ph.D. in 2000. She is a senior research fellow of Ahatanhel Krymskyi Institute of Oriental Studies. Her main research interest is Egyptology and the history of Egyptological studies and ancient history in Ukraine. She is the author of the monograph on autobiographical inscriptions from the Egyptian tombs of the Old Kingdom. She is the author of academic translations of the ancient Egyptian texts into Ukrainian. In 2019, Olena Romanova studied and cataloged the photo archive of Krymskyi in the Krymskyi Institute of Oriental Studies and published a series of articles on the archive as well as unknown documents about Krymskyi from the other archives of Ukraine. And her paper, the title of her paper is Ahatanhel Krymskyi and the History of the Ancient East. Please go ahead.
Thank you.
Dr.
Good afternoon. Firstly, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers of this conference. I am delighted to listen all the reports, and I'm happy to present my report too. Can I share my presentation? Yes.
Yes, you have access. And
please remove another presentation.
Please, Dr. Sivkov.
Yes,
Yeah.
sure. Пані Марина, у вас презентація не вже. Я її вже прибрав?
Так, уже все немає.
Ага, вже дякую.
Thank you. So we know Ahatanhel Krymskyi as a prominent Orientalist and as a founder of Ukrainian Oriental studies. As well, we know Krymskyi as one of the founders of Ukrainian science and Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. I would like to draw your attention for such sphere of Krymskyi activity as the history of ancient East and ancient civilizations of the East. Krymskyi was an Arab-based anthropologist and an Iranist, so the history of ancient East was not in scope of his main research interests. But the meticulous analysis of the contents of his textual and visual heritage provide me proofs for conclusion that the history of ancient Orient was a part of his interest during all his life. His interest in the ancient history of the East civilizations began in Beirut. During his academic mission to Beirut and to Levant, in his letters to the family, he mentioned his visits to ancient sites of Assyrians, Phoenicians, ancient Greek, and other ancient civilizations which were existing on the territory of ancient Levant. Visiting to the ancient site encouraged Krymskyi to start collecting the ancient East artifacts. He bought them in the local antiquarian shops. Prince Gagarin, the secretary of Russian Council mission in Beirut, also was a collector of ancient East artifacts, mainly Assyrian spells. The shared interests and the cooperation made both persons to become friends. Gagarin presented some of the ancient artifacts to Krymskyi, who sent them to the Moscow Archaeological Society. Later, Russian philologists published articles about these artifacts. From the modern point of view, this activity is hardly can be so as legal, because now it is a great problem, because it is can be considered as a looting of cultural heritage. But at the very end of 19th century, it was regarded as a normal and legal activity. So the main part of the Europeans who visited Eastern countries performed the same behavior. They collected artifacts and of ancient civilization together with exotic product of local craft. Moreover, it was the main way for development of museum collections around the world. But the interest of Krymskyi to the ancient Eastern civilization was not only practical. In the 19th century in Europe, the proper term Oriental studies means mainly the study of ancient East, rather than the study of contemporary East countries and nations. The ancient Near East study consisted the large part of Oriental study. Development of Philology and Egyptology, dozens of archaeological excavation on the territory of Near East, discovering the new cities, texts, artifacts, shaped the common European vision of the Orient as ancient Orient. The large part of the academic and popular literature on the Oriental studies published in Europe in the 19th century was about the ancient Near East. In contrary to the European situation, the study of ancient Near East were on the very dawn of their development the Russian Empire in the second half of the 19th century. It seems that Krymskyi was the first Ukrainian researcher who paid attention to the study and teaching of the history of ancient East and its civilizations. He recognized the importance of the study of this branch of Oriental studies, as well as necessity to engage the students into this set of disciplines, which were the prominent in the old Oriental studies at the beginning of 19th century, but which were actually undeveloped in the Russian Empire. Krymskyi was not a researcher of ancient Near East himself, but he spent a sufficient time and effort to facilitation the development of these disciplines in Ukraine and in Russia as well. He also contributed to promotion of the scientific information on the ancient Near East, its history, cultures, and literature. Firstly, his and Ivan Khanenko project must notice. After introducing a number of translations newly discovered ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian texts by Gaston Maspero in his Le Conte populaire de l'Égypte ancienne, European readers discovered the literature of ancient Near East. The interest of common public in the reading of such kind of book was great. Krymskyi understood that it is needed to make Ukrainian readers familiar with ancient literatures of the East and to make ancient literatures more accessible for Ukrainian readers. His vision was realized in the collaboration with Ivan Khanenko. In 1896, Krymskyi and Khanenko published translation into Ukrainian of selected tales from the book of William Alexander Colston, Popular Tales and Fictions, Their Migrations and Transformations. They published only the ancient Arabian tale of Antar, and additionally they supplied this with translation by Khanenko of the ancient Egyptian tale from the book by Maspero, namely the tale about two brothers. It was the first translation from the ancient Egyptian into Ukrainian with the help of French language, but it was first translation in Ukrainian literature. In such a way, Krymsky and Khanenko partly filled the lacuna existing in Ukrainian literature in respect of translation from ancient Oriental literatures into Ukrainian. The preparation for this book was made by Krymsky during his stay in Beirut. His letters from the Beirut attest this fact. Educational activity was a sufficient part of the heritage left by Krymsky. He put a lot of effort to teach Oriental studies for students. He was also the first Ukrainian Orientalist who began to prepare academic lecturing courses and manuals and textbooks for students on the ancient history of the Near East and as well as the Middle East too. He is the author of the first book in Ukrainian and Russian history on Elam, on ancient Elam, a civilization of Elam. He recognized the need to fill another gap in the system of education of ancient history of Near East and Middle East and Russian Empire and later in Ukraine. Krymsky prepared several manuals, but I want to stop just at one his manuscript. These manuscripts give me the ground to conclude that we have a new book of Ahatanhel Krymskyi that have never been published at all. The name of the book approximately was History of Ancient Orient, or maybe it was a section of the history of the Orient. The manuscript doesn't exist as one unit. I reconstruct it in a few documents from the archive of Krymsky in the Institute of Manuscript from Vernadsky National Library of Ukraine. The text of this book was separated. The text of this book was separated in several parts, and now every part has a different inventory number. This number don't come one after another, so I am not sure that I have found all the parts of this manuscript. As well, I don't know how many parts I shall find in future. Now I can identify 3 parts of the book. One part is introduction. It begins with explication what the term history of ancient East means. And it puts essay on the historical documents on the history of ancient East. The second part is about the ancient Egypt. It discusses the meaning of the term Egyptology, and it includes the essays on historiography and historical sources on the history of ancient Egypt. The third part, it is about Philology, with the similar essay. The text of the manuscript is partly printed with typewriting and partly printed on the printing press, as I can conclude. It has correction made by hand by Krymsky. The document were written and printed in Russian. The date of the manuscript can be established within the period between 1913 and 1918. These parts appear to be the manuscript of the lecturing post by Krymsky on the history of Orient, or maybe on the history of ancient Orient only. During a long period of 20 years, Krymsky was a professor of Arabic studies and other Oriental studies in Moscow Lazarev Institute of Oriental Languages. He had lecturing course on the history of East, so maybe we see the part of it. But the text under consideration evidently was prepared for publication as a book, because the part considering the ancient Egypt was preprint. It is a correction by hand made by Krymsky. I demonstrate here on the one page of the manuscript that gives an interesting insight for Krymsky's vision of Egyptology. This page also attests the fact that Krymsky had some minimal knowledge of some Egyptian hieroglyphs, because these hieroglyphs they were not printed, they were drawn with hand. Some of these hieroglyphs were made and drawn correctly, some of them were drawn erroneously, as it is common case if the beginner tried to write hieroglyphs. Also have to note that some documents prove the idea that Krymsky could read cuneiform too, maybe some bits only, and just cuneiform text of ancient Iranian language only. In his letter to colleague, Krymsky mentions the fact that he spent a lot of time for preparing the lecturing course on the ancient history of Iran, because the main part of his primary sources were written in cuneiforms. Krymsky also paid attention for studying academic studies of the etiquette in ancient Near East in the museums of Ukraine. As academic manager of Ukrainian science, he facilitated these reports of his colleagues from Ukrainian museums. In 1928, the old Ukrainian museum town, now it is the National Historical and Cultural Preserve Kyiv, launched a landscape project on study and restoration and conservation of the collection of Egyptian artifacts in the museum. The head of this action was the director of the museum, Petro. The Egyptologists from Russian Hermitage Museum, as Militia Metier and Philology, and as well as Ukrainian Egyptologists Hidovich were engaged. Also, a Ukrainian team of art restorers and conservator led by prominent art restorers Philology were engaged too. At that time, the museum was a part of Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, and the financial support of the study and restoration was improbable without General Secretary of the Academy, Ahatanhel Krymskyi, and his advocacy of the project before the administrative body of the Academy. And at the very beginning, at the very end, the investigation the archives and library of Krymsky in the Institute of Manuscript bring new visual documents connected with the 10 of ancient East. This set of the documents, the visual documents, was found by Vladimir, and he engaged me to study these visual documents. So now we can conclude that Krymsky collected a comprehensive collection of visual materials, mainly photos, of ancient sites and monuments of Egypt, Constantinople, Jerusalem, and the number site of Ottoman Empire. This collection needed further studies and further publication together with special commentary, because it is of great importance as a set of visual documents recording the ancient buildings, structures, monuments, sites, as well as landscapes of cities and countries of the Near East as they were at the beginning of the 20th century. So I would like to conclude that Ahatanhel Krymskyi contributed and put his efforts and spent his time for facilitation the study of ancient Near East in Ukraine. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for very professional paper. And let me okay, thank you. Let me give the floor to the last, our speaker, Yulia Fil, Ph.D. in History, Junior Research Fellow at the Asia Pacific Department, Ahatanhel Krymskyi Institute of Oriental Studies, National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, Senior Research Fellow at the Asian Arts Department at Bohdan and Varvara Khanenko National Museum of Arts in Ukraine. Yulia Fil her field of research includes nationalism in India, the modern trends of Hindu religiosity, and the development of Vaishnavism in Ukraine and all over the world. Yulia is also the author of the monograph on Indian colonial history, Westernized Hindu elites of northern India. So we're happy to have you today, and Yulia's paper is called Ahatanhel Krymskyi's Views on Sufism. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, dear organizers, thank you for this honor to present the results of my humble investigations here. And yes, my report will be dedicated to the Krymsky views on Sufism, with a special stress on Jalaluddin Rumi's poetry. And as we all know, Ahatanhel Krymskyi was a scholar of very wide range of interests. He was a historian, philologist, translator, and what is the most important in the context of my report now, he was a great lover of literature and poetry, especially Persian poetry and Jalaluddin Rumi's poetry. That's why the aim of my investigations was to find out which kind of approach he had to study Sufism, to study Persian literature and Persian culture. And he really loved it because his legacy on Persian history and literature is quite big. I can mention some works of Ahatanhel Krymskyi. It's the sketches of the development of Sufism until the end of the 3rd century of Hijra, written in Russian. It's, of course, a 3-volume of history of Persia, its literature and Dervish theosophy, the work of him. It's also Persian history and literature in Ukrainian. He wrote a lot of articles for Brockhaus and Yifron Encyclopedic Dictionary on different Sufi poets as Saadi, Nizami, Jalaluddin Rumi, also Sinai, yes. So he was really fond of this topic, and I think the key to understand how Krymskyi worked with it is to understand his approach in Oriental studies in general. And here the very prominent feature of his approach is that he used not only pure historical sources, but also literary sources. He used not only documents and chronicles, but also poetry. He thought that history and poetry are undividable, and poetry contains historical truths as well, though hidden in some poetic fantasies or folk intuitions. Even his greatest work on Persian history has its title not occasionally. As we remember, the title of this work is History of Persia, its literature, and the Dervish theosophy. I want to stress its literature. Yes, the history and literature was always together in his approach. So this aesthetic attitude was the part of scientific cognition for him, I think. And when he worked with Sufism, we also find this approach. Ahatanhel Krymskyi highlights two branches of Sufism. The first branch, it is the Sufism from the Western Islamic world, which was inspired much by Christian aesthetic. And the second branch is the so-called Eastern Sufism from Eastern Islamic Indo-Persian world, which was under the great influence of Indian culture, of Buddhism and Neoplatonism. And the first one he called mystical, and the second one he called pantheistic. And I will return to this point later about pantheistic Sufism. The poetry of Jalaluddin Rumi was the good example for him exactly of this second in the Persian Eastern branch of Sufism. And Rumi was one of the most favorite Sufi poets of Krymskyi, though he never translated him directly, he never translated him by himself, but he used the translations of academician Fedir Korsh, who was a famous translator of Persian literature, and he made great comments and corrections on this poetry. And in his History of Persia, where all his translations of Sufi poets are included, he declared that his approach to Sufi poetry differs from the Edward Whitfield's approach. Edward Whitfield is the English translator of Persian poetry, actually. And he developed his thought, and he explains that whether Whitfield paid more attention to the moralistic part, the second moralistic part of Rumi's poetry. He personally pays attention to the first belletristic, so-called belletristic part of Rumi's poetry. To make it clear, Rumi parables or Rumi poems usually consist of two parts. First part it's an actual plot, the story of the parable, and the second part is the moralistic part. It contains moral and some transcendental sense of the parable. Mentioned Edward Whitfield, he translated in poetic way only the second moralistic part of the parable. But the second part was just retold by him in the short prose form. Ahatanhel Krymskyi proposed a completely opposite way to translate Rumi's poetry. He said that it is better to translate first part in poetic way. And the second part is less important for him. Second part can be retold, can be shortened, can be translated in a prose way. And I think such position of Ukrainian scholar reveals his attitude and his perception of Sufi poetry, because it means that he was attracted more by literally common and unambiguous part of the poetry, not by this transcendental, mystical part. This conclusion also is proven when we are talking about pantheism of Sufism, as Ahatanhel Krymskyi put it. Really, he called this second branch of Sufism, this Indo-Persian Sufism, as pantheistic. And it really make us to ask why Krymskyi put this term, why he applied this term to Sufism. Because according to Islamic theology, according to Sufi theology, according to modern religious studies, it's quite incorrect. And I think the key to understand why Ahatanhel Krymskyi called it pantheistic lays in the fact that, again, the main source to study Sufism for him was poetry. And Sufi poetry is really very mystical. It's full of different mystical inspirations, which sometimes contradicts to each other. Because of this, Krymskyi probably treated Sufism and Sufi poetry too literally and a little bit too narrowly. So we come to the conclusion again that his perception was a little bit down to earth, a little bit less mystical, and more literally than other translators and other scholars probably see in the Sufi poetry. Thank you very much for attention. That's my conclusion. Yes.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. And so our third panel is over, and our conference is over as well. And let me say a few closure words and make some conclusions. Our conference, Ahatanhel Krymskyi and Lebanon, held in American University of Beirut. 16 speakers from 4 countries participated in it. Academicians, diplomats, clergy, students. 12 academic papers were presented. And also, of course, we had a wonderful presentation of Mazeppa's Gospel. This conference is the result of collaboration between Embassy of Ukraine in Lebanon, American University in Beirut, Department of Arabic and Near Eastern Languages, Sheikh Zayed Chair for Arabic and Islamic Studies, and Ahatanhel Krymskyi Institute of Oriental Studies. And we would like to thank all of you and to thank all the speakers and to all our partners. And we are looking forward for future cooperation. Our conference is closed. Thank you very much.